Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center and to this program that's co-sponsored by the Mexico Institute and the Canada Institute here at the center. I'm Jim Dickmeyer. I'm a State Department Foreign Service officer with the good fortune of being assigned here for a year, working on North American competitiveness issues. I'll be moderating today. We have with us a distinguished panel, Ambassador Tony Wayne, who was the U.S. Ambassador in Mexico during the last NOWS meeting in Toluca. Duncan Wood, who's head of the Mexico Institute, and Laura Dawson, who's head of the Canada Institute. We're going to jump right into comments from each of the panelists, and we want to give them plenty of time for discussion and questions from the audience. Let me turn it over to Ambassador Wayne, who will give us a bit of context about the NOWS, this meeting, and some of the structure, and a little bit on the U.S. perspective on that. Ambassador?
Great, thanks, Jim. First, I think I'll mention a couple of facts, because the depth and breadth of our relationship with our two neighbors is often neglected and not fully understood. These two relationships touch the lives of more Americans than any other relationships we have in the world. They are the largest export markets for the United States. About 35% of U.S. exports go to Canada and Mexico. And that's reflected in that they are the number one or number two markets for a vast majority of states in the United States, so it's widespread. Estimates say up to 14 million U.S. jobs are tied to that trade and the related investment that comes in. And the importance is reciprocal. We buy 81% of Mexico's exports and 77% of Canada's exports. That total trade is about $1.3 trillion a year. That comes out to about $3 million a minute that crosses the two borders in one way or the other. And it's not just trade. Investment is a very big part of it. The United States has invested about $500 billion in its two neighbors. Canada has invested a surprisingly large amount when you think about it, about $360 billion, 350 or so of that in the United States. And Mexico, with a smaller economy, has still invested about $19 billion in its North American partners. The other aspect of this is in the people-to-people part of it, some of which is tied to trade, but not all tied to trade. Transit across the border is about 1.4 million people, about across the two borders, 1.4 million a day. There are about, in addition to that daily back and forth part of the regular business, there are about 40 million overnight visitors coming into the U.S. each year from Mexico and Canada. And the United States has about 36 million Americans who go to spend a night or more in one of the two other countries. And then plus we have all the people that have the ethnic and heritage ties to one country or the other. Mexico there are well over 30 million U.S. citizens with heritage ties to Mexico, for example. So in that context, the three countries have been working in a number of clusters of areas for quite a long time, but certainly since the last NOLS in 2014, as Jim mentioned. Some of this work is in the same subject area, but is happening bilaterally. Some of it is trilateral, but they will talk about all the three clusters when the leaders get together in the summit, and we'll see some of the outcomes discussed in those. So the four big clusters are, first, the sort of economic set of issues, and that has a lot to do with global competitiveness. How to make these economies more competitive in the world, how to reduce costs for consumers, how to compete better with rivals in notably China, but including others around the world. And under this area, there are a number of subcategories. A lot of it is around borders and points of entry, and we can get into specifics of that later, and my colleagues will mention some of it, but it has to do with special faster entry for trusted travelers, special entry for trusted shippers, a number of other process changes that are really technical and don't seem really interesting, but they can make a really big difference. Standards and regulations are another area. How can you have a harmony, a mutual recognition across North America that reduce costs? How do you make it so that more small and medium enterprises can participate? How can you encourage innovation that covers the whole continent? And then how can you involve all the people involved in this economy in your process? How can the stakeholders have a role as they're going forward? Second big cluster, energy and the environment. For those who might have looked at the articles in the Washington Post and the New York Times today, you'll see that at least one of the big clusters of announcements is going to be around climate change, the environment, and energy, and specifically green energy, and getting more of that clean energy for the electricity sector. But it comes in the context of a real opportunity to make significant advances in North American energy cooperation and tied to the environment, and Duncan will talk a little bit more about that. The third big cluster has to do with security and justice. And this has to do with all the bad things that can happen or do happen across borders. And that goes from terrorism to law enforcement, against drug trafficking, against money laundering, all those things where governments need to work better together to stop bad guys. And we can talk about that in more detail also. And then international and regional cooperation is an important area, and that some of it has to do with helping countries in the region, like Central America. Some of it has to do with, can we coordinate better in the UN and other international organizations? Peacekeeping is a possibility in that area. And what we've seen is over the past couple of years, sets of ministers have been working really hard on this. The commerce ministers on the competitiveness agenda with help from some others, the Homeland Security ministers working both on the competitiveness agenda and the border security issues, the energy ministers working closely together, of course, the trade ministers working on the TPP largely, which touches the North American agenda also. The foreign ministers getting together, and then the defense ministers will be meeting again in August of this year. So let me stop there and invite my colleague, Laura Dawson. No?
No.
Duncan.
Jim,
Duncan.
what
Oh,
was the-
sorry.
Sorry.
Duncan. All right, sorry.
Duncan is up next to do that.
Just because you were sitting next
You
to
know,
me.
you get ambassadors and they want to be moderators and panelists and stars and all that
Sorry.
stuff. Duncan's up next to speak
Sorry.
a bit from the Mexican perspective and also to focus again, as Tony said, on the energy environment pillar.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you, Tony. Let me just say a little thing, first of all, about the Wilson Center in North America. It is a real luxury at a think tank to actually have a North America program. You'd think that the United States, being geographically located in North America, there would be a lot more of it going on, but there's not. You look around town, and in fact, this is the only place that has a Canada Institute, and it's the only place that has a Mexico Institute, and therefore we're the only place that has a North America program at this point in time. And it's a luxury in part because of the people that we have here, and so we're very, very blessed, obviously, to be able to work together as Canada and Mexico Institutes, but also to have public policy fellows like Tony Wayne, who brings enormous experience and also insights from across all areas, I have to say. To have Jim here has been a real pleasure over the past few months, helping us to guide us, not just the things that we were planning on doing, but coming up with new ideas. Arturo Sarucan, who spends a lot of time here as well, it's great to have that public policy experience from the Mexican side. And the contacts that these guys bring with former policymakers. I mean, Sergio Alcocer was here a couple of weeks ago for an event, and very, very important to hear his insights now that he's outside of the process as a former subsecretario for Relaciones Exteriores in Mexico. Now to look at the process from the outside, still incredibly supportive, but actually to be able to give some insights on what the challenges are. So I have to say that, as I said before, I feel very blessed to be able to work here at the Wilson Center on North America. Let me talk about Mexico now, and to talk about how the NALS fits into a broader perspective of Mexican foreign policy. Then to talk about Mexico-Canada relations, because that's what's going on today, of course. You have Trudeau and Peña Nieto talking after a lovely dinner at Casa Loma last night. And then to talk a little bit about sort of Mexico's concerns going into the NALS. What we've seen under Peña Nieto, I think it would be fair to say, is that as his domestic political problems have intensified, he's looked more and more to the international stage as a way to project himself in a more favorable light. We've seen a lot of traveling around the world, trying to minimize contact with protesters wherever he goes. Of course, there are a lot of human rights protesters, anti-corruption, transparency protesters, pretty much wherever he goes in the world. But he likes the stage. He likes to be at major international meetings, and he likes to have the bilateral focus. Not that this is unique to Peña Nieto in any way, of course. Peña Nieto, follows comes in a long line of Mexican presidents who have sought to do exactly this kind of thing. We saw it with President Vicente Fox as soon as his domestic agenda ground to a halt. We saw it with Felipe Calderón projecting himself onto the international stage, in particular with the area of climate change, which I'll talk about in a second. And of course, it's an escape. And Peña Nieto is in the last 2 years of his administration, but he's actually managed to seize the opportunity in foreign policy to an extraordinary degree. And that's because what he's done is he's built upon basic principles of Mexican foreign policy that have been established over the last decade, and managed to use his successes in the first half of his administration as a way to gather international support and continue that international support, so that in fact he has used it in quite a politically savvy way. In particular, what's happening today in his conversations with Trudeau, I think he's going to claim, or his administration will claim, that this is a great victory for Mexican foreign policy. The fact that the Canadians are going to overturn the visa requirement on Mexicans visiting Canada is something which is seen as being a great foreign policy achievement. Now, of course, it's entirely dependent upon the fact that Trudeau came into power in Canada, came with a very different perspective on this than his predecessor, Stephen Harper. But it does move the relationship, the bilateral relationship, from what we could say was the height of irritation, I mean, very, very tetchy relations between the two governments, to a new rapprochement. And eliminating that irritant actually will be very, very important in moving the trilateral relationship forward, not just the bilateral relationship. I have very low expectations of the Mexico-Canada bilateral relationship. When I lived in Mexico for all those years, it was my job at the university at ITAM to actually study Canada-Mexico relations, and I have to say it was an incredibly boring job. Nothing ever happened. The most exciting times were when, in fact, there was a bronca between the two countries, when there was an argument of some kind. You say, oh, finally, we have something to talk about. And what was interesting about that was that every time there was a problem, a political issue between the two countries, it forced stakeholders as well as the governments to actually come into contact with each other and to reevaluate the relationship and to say, actually, we do kind of need each other, if only because of our relationship with the United States of America. The challenge in the Mexico-Canada relationship has always been to find the beef. Where is it? For a while, they were actually talking about beef exports, so you could find it right there. But beyond that, it's been very, very difficult to say, you can talk about the dramatic growth, the exponential growth in exports to the other country, but that's because they began at such a low level, and of course that will slow down over time. You can talk about the integrated manufacturing platform of North America, but of course we know that a lot of that depends upon the United States being there, and the United States is the key player. But I think that they're coming to an understanding, at least at this point, that in fact they need each other because of the region of North America. They need each other because, particularly in the light of international instability, volatility in financial markets and in the global economy, North America matters more than it ever has before. A couple of words about Mexico's domestic political situation as Peña Nieto goes to Ottawa, or is in Ottawa. Obviously, the domestic political situation in Mexico is far from ideal. Low level of support for the president himself and his government. Highly contested elections at the state level in Mexico earlier on this summer. And of course, losing a number of key governorships across the country. The economy in Mexico has a really tough time, I have to say. They've done so many things right, and yet economic growth doesn't come up to the levels that they want to see it. And the easy thing to say is that, well, Mexico always disappoints on economic growth. But there are a number of issues that still are pending that stand in the way of actually getting up to those higher economic levels, or levels of economic growth. Of course, the first half of the Peña Nieto administration was all about the reform agenda. It was all about actually making the changes in the economy that would bring higher productivity and make the economy more competitive. But they've disappointed in terms of delivering higher economic growth. What the agenda has to be right now is to try to strengthen the rule of law. We've seen the coming into force of the justice reform that was passed in 2008. Earlier on this month, of course, the deadline for the implementation of that has passed. And justice reform, rule of law, obviously public security are all issues that need to be corrected. But perhaps more than any other, is the question of corruption in Mexico. And the debate, national debate over the 3-for-3 law and the broader conversation about how to strengthen a national anti-corruption system is there. IMCO, a Mexican think tank, has argued that in fact this costs several % of GDP because of the impact, not just of theft itself, but in fact of the dissuasive effect that corruption has on foreign investment, but more importantly on actually national investment in Mexico. Smaller companies suffer to an exorbitant degree because of the fact that they have to pay bribes and because the bureaucratic process is so complicated. Peña Nieto also goes to Canada in the context thinking about the image of Mexico in the United States, of course the presidential campaign here, and the fact that Mexico has been dragged through the mud, or the name of Mexico has been dragged through the mud. And so Peña Nieto sees this as an opportunity as well to get a more favorable perspective on Mexico from both Prime Minister Trudeau and President Obama. And that's something which is vitally important, because that is much more for the US audience than it is for the Mexican audience. To show Peña Nieto and show Mexico in a favorable light, sitting there with his counterparts from Canada and the United States, should be of enormous benefit, or some benefit rather, in the current debates about Mexico and the United States. And lastly, I would say that Peña Nieto believes that the conversations, particularly on energy and climate change, will help the reform agenda. Putting Mexico's energy reform in the context of integration of energy policy and energy systems in North America is of importance. And in fact, many of the stakeholders from the business community, as well as think tankers and universities, have argued exactly that. So before I pass the microphone over to Laura, let me just say a few words, and we can go deeper into this in the Q&A, but on the energy and climate change agenda. Tony and Jim have already mentioned the Toluca process that began in 2014. I see that the biggest achievement that came out of Toluca is, in fact, the regular meetings that have taken place between the energy and natural resources ministers of the three countries. In the 2 years or 2.5 years since Toluca, they've met 3 times. And not only have they had these meetings, but they've actually engaged in a preparation and ongoing conversation for these meetings that has now led to the creation of a North American climate change and energy working group. And that's an important institutionalization of the energy relationship between the three countries. It gives them a capacity to actually harmonize or to make their energy policies compatible and to talk about important issues such as integration of electric grids, etc. But perhaps most important at this point in time is they're beginning to, or they have begun to gather data on a regional basis as opposed to just on a national basis. And that's something that many people have made the point, it's a vital first step. It's not very exciting that you have common databases, but in fact, it's a sine qua non for moving to the next level, and they're finally doing that. In terms of the political level, the fact that the three heads of government are now on the same page, more or less, on climate change is a very, very important step forward. This is the first time that this has happened, that you have all three governments actually feeling more or less the same way about the importance of climate change and the importance of them playing a coordinated role in mitigation. Mexico, of course, has a highly integrated, consolidated climate change and energy strategy. Of the three countries, I would say that it's perhaps the leading example of this. When you look at Mexico's energy reform, the hydrocarbons law, the energy transition law, and the electricity reform laws are all compatible in the sense they fit together very, very nicely. And the capstone is really Mexico's international climate policy. They all come together to support Mexico's statements and commitments through the Paris process to reduce its emissions by 50% by 2050. Of course, Canada is making a transition now, led by the province of Alberta, I would say, but also, of course, you have to mention Ontario's commitment to eliminate coal-fired generation. And, you know, if we can see a province like Alberta actually committing to serious emissions reductions, committing to a carbon tax, all of a sudden you begin to see what is possible in the rest of the country. And not every province will be able to make the same kind of commitments as Alberta, but it does provide hope. And lastly, of course, in the United States, Obama sees the issue of climate change as very much a legacy issue. It's one of the things that he would like to leave behind him from his last nows. The likely commitments, Tony has already mentioned, you know, the 50% of electricity from clean power. That's not renewables or green. It includes nuclear power. Of the three countries, Canada is best equipped to meet that because it already does. You know, has 59% of its power from clean sources. Mexico is on the right path to do that, and my expectation is, in fact, that Mexico will meet that by 2050. It may even meet it earlier if it is able to get hold of international financing for that. Very, very important that the issue of methane emissions has been discussed and will be discussed tomorrow. Canada and the United States, of course, have already committed to serious reductions in methane emissions. There has been a process of lobbying and pressuring Mexico to sign on as well. It looks like Peña Nieto is likely to make that commitment tomorrow. And lastly, on climate change, I think we're going to see the three leaders committing to work together in international forums on climate change. We've seen that, you know, North America as a bloc is now a credible actor in international climate negotiations, simply because there's a good news story to tell there. And it's far from guaranteed. Of course, we can see changes of government, change of administration. We can see all kinds of political problems emerging. But it does seem as though now is the right time to be able to make these kind of commitments. The one thing I think is missing on the climate change front right now that is possible and would receive a favorable welcome from the populations of all three countries is any real discussion, not on mitigation, but on adaptation. We all know that climate change is a reality. We all know it's happening, but there's been very little conversation about how do the three countries work together on issues such as natural disasters, violent weather, flooding, drought. Drought is, of course, already affecting many parts of North America and will obviously impact upon agricultural production as well as human migration. What about the link between climate change and pathogens? The three countries have a good record of working together on public health issues. There's a lot of conversation right now about Zika virus and whether there is some tie there to climate change. And lastly, an issue which came up in some of our conversations here at the Wilson Center on North America, the question of invasive species. The fact is that what never used to be a concern in terms of an invasive species now, because of the changing climate, becomes a reality. Species that couldn't survive in Canada because it was too cold, all of a sudden will survive there. And other species that wouldn't have survived in Mexico because it was too wet or too dry or whatever, they become a reality. So I think we need to have a conversation over the the issue of adaptation to climate change in all of its different manifestations, so that we're actually much better prepared for cross-border problems as they emerge. Thank you very much, and back to you, Jim.
Thank you, Duncan. It set the table very nicely for further discussion later on. Let's turn the microphone over to Laura Dawson, Director of the Canada Institute. She'll talk obviously about the Canada perspective and a little bit more about competitiveness and trade as it's going to be discussed.
Sure. Thank you, Jim. This is, I think, from a Canadian perspective especially, a very Dickensian leader summit. It is the best of times and it's the worst of times. Starting with the best of times, the relationship between the two leaders well, the three leaders, but certainly the two leaders could not be better between Trudeau and Obama. It's great, warm personal relations. They've already had a state visit. It's been called in the media a bromance. So in contrast to previous relations between Harper and Obama, this is a brand new day. It's also the best of times in terms of a new leaf between Canada and Mexico, and I'll talk about that in a minute as well. But then in the worst of times, we have President Obama on his way out the door, and it's by no means clear what's going to follow that. And of course, it's very difficult for the outgoing president to make any meaningful commitments or concessions that he would leave for the next president. So there's not a lot that can be done that is deep. And also, of course, we've got the issues with the global turn against trade and the negative impact or the negative perceptions of international trade, and what it means for Americans, what it means for Britons, what it means for folks around the world. So Canada, as a trading nation that depends upon external trade for its GDP, that depends on the United States trade for like 75% of its exports, having a downturn in trade, having a negative impression of trade in the U.S. is very worrisome for Canada. At the same time, I was doing some media yesterday, and the interviewer said, well, is this really a low point in public perception of trade? And I thought to myself, I've been doing this since 1989, this is the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. I can't think of the high point. We've always had, trade is always at a low public policy ebb. Nobody liked the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. The NAFTA was a ticket to ruin. I remember the battle in Seattle and the launch of Doha. Some of you might remember the battles over the multilateral agreement on investment. We just have not had a good day for trade. So I don't think it is particularly bad, but it creates some challenges for this leader summit. I think Canada is involved primarily in a careful diplomatic exercise. The Canadian officials have to work with Mexico in order to build a rapprochement there. Prime Minister Trudeau's campaign promise was, I'm getting rid of the visa. And it looks as though he's going to do that. But the Americans are keeping a visa. So is that going to create tensions with Mexicans coming to the United States through Canada? Or is there some way to work that out, to bridge that gap? Also, while Canada wants to restore strong relations with Mexico, as Duncan was saying, the economic case is still not, I'm not going to say it's not there. I think there's a strong economic case for trilateral trade, but it's not visible because our trade is so integrated. And Canadian inputs go to the U.S. and are dealt with there, and then they go to Mexico. And with integrated supply chains, it's really hard to see where the Canada-Mexico trade is, even though technical folks unpack it and they do find it. There are fewer than 100,000 people born in Mexico who are Canadian citizens or permanent residents. We just don't have strong diaspora demand for stronger Mexico-Canada relations. So the business case is hard to make, especially as the new Prime Minister is trying to restore these relations. So on the one hand, Canada in this Leader Summit is trying to, I think, mend fences with Mexico in a balanced way that won't prejudice its relations with the United States. And speaking of relations with the United States, I think that's even the harder issue. trade is extremely important for Canada. The trade and competitiveness agenda is extremely important for Canada with the United States. And this, the timing of the summit means they really can't talk about too much. If I am a Canadian official, I am looking at what's happening in the U.S. Election campaign and saying, okay, I don't want to add any fuel to the Trump camp necessarily, and I don't want to do anything that's going to prejudice future relations by making some sort of commitment or demand at this point that is going to be blown up in the election. So I think the Canadians are going to have to step very carefully. And so that's unfortunate in some ways because it will not, I don't anticipate we're going to see much advancing of the trade and economic agenda at all in this summit. I think we will see announcements about doing good in the world. I think focusing on things that the three countries can do in terms of international climate commitments is probably a strong possibility in the energy and climate change. We're not going to see anything, I don't think, on things like pipeline permitting and softwood lumber and things that are near and dear to Canadian hearts. This is going to be a strong, positive, feel-good exercise. And the relationship needs that. I'm not being overly critical, but now will not be the time to deal with irritants. It is somebody who's been moving to the trade area, but as somebody who's been doing this stuff for a long time, the trilateral relationship is extremely important, but it's extremely difficult to find trilateral issues that are of equal importance. Okay, we're interested in trade, we're interested in borders, we're interested in security, we're interested in competitiveness, we're interested in infrastructure. Give me the project that satisfies both Canada, US, and Mexico on those issues. There are very few things for which there is equal trilateral interest. And so officials really struggle with coming up with recommendations for these summits and for these events. And so we get down to the minutia, and we get down to things like pesticide residue levels and migratory birds. Not that the birds are not important. We get to things like cluster mapping and common nomenclature and metrics for things. These are all very important. They help to move the agenda forward, but they're not sexy issues for big North American announcements. So we're not going to have, in my guess, my crystal ball says, no big announcements at this summit. I think, though, there's several problems on the trade side. Even leaving aside the public perception and global perceptions against trade right now, this has become a difficult trade relationship to manage because it's actually working pretty well. It has kind of reached its level point in terms of the North American Free Trade Agreement governing most of the trade in North America, the reduction of tariffs, the rules of origin, the dispute settlement. This is not too bad. It's not the best, but it's not too bad. What has really been difficult is to move the relationship outward. We tried to do it with the TPP, and if you read some of my stuff, I will say it hasn't been particularly successful through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's expanded the NAFTA, but it hasn't deepened the NAFTA. I think that we need a new mechanism moving forward to deal with this asymmetry or dual bilateral, double focus of issues. And so rather than moving forward on here are the specific issues that we want to deal with on the trilateral basis, I think we need to be looking at common principles for governing our trade relationship. And one of the principles I would suggest, and it's nothing new, it's been in operation in the GATT system since 1948, but it's the principle of the negative list. It's the principle of agreeing that this issue, this policy area should be harmonized unless you can find some public policy reason not to. So you can exclude the politically sensitive things, but moving forward in new regulatory and rulemaking, if we can come together on a trilateral basis and say, no new rules that are inconsistent and incompatible with each other's unless there's a strong public policy reason to do so. And then we focus that on movement of goods, movement of services, movement of investment, and movement of tourists and business people. And that's all. The simple categories, simple principles, but extremely difficult in the details. So that's my proposal for the next Leader Summit, is the negative list approach.
Laura, thank you. I'm going to start with the first question, and it's for the whole panel, and it's one that's obvious out there as we look at the vote in Britain and what is kind of holding sway in the headlines and speculation about how that affects that particular arrangement of the European Union and the trade arrangement and other aspects of that. I'd ask the panel to take a look at NAFTA and give us some sense of whether there are parallels, there are differences. Will NAFTA be affected by this? What's happening with NAFTA, given kind of some of the reactions we see in the world and in the U.S. Towards trade that you kind of mentioned in kind of a rejection of or questioning of trade agreements? Start anywhere we want.
Start with the guy in the green tie.
And the green tie. We'll
Guy
stay
in
in
the
the same
green
one.
tie. All right. Well, clearly one of the big differences is that NAFTA is a different model of economic integration and cooperation than you have in Europe with the EU. We don't have the centralized institutions. There's much more that's carried out in a negotiation between governments, both trilaterally and bilaterally. And there's much more of a space for the private sector actually to build these networks, which is what happened over NAFTA. They built this integrated chain of production, of innovation, of supply. And they've asked the government to step in a number of areas along the way to help have better regulation. They don't quite have that goal that Laura set out yet, but they would like something like that. So there's a basic structural difference. The similarity is that people who are left out of both systems are targeting parts of those systems, and whether that be trade, whether it be immigration policy, you see unhappiness on both sides of the Atlantic about that. And so the clear message to elites is, you got to take care of people who are left out. And we can talk about that, but there are a number of programs that are supposed to do that that haven't done that very well on either side of the Atlantic. And so you do have to listen to that message. But I think in North America, you have a model that has actually produced very good results. A number of recent studies have looked at North America and said that it's actually performing better than all other continents in the world as far as economic performance. It might not be, it's not as good as we want, the productivity is not as high as we want, but it's actually relatively performing well. And part of that, I think, has to do with the way that we've set it up, has to do with letting there be a lot of flexibility with private sectors working with each other, civil society working with each other, and a lighter hand on where the governments get involved.
Yeah, it's a question that I've been thinking about a lot, obviously, from Mexico's perspective. Mexico knew that it would be impacted by Brexit. Mexico, of course, went to the IMF and sought out a financing facility in the event of currency volatility, attack on the peso, and that's, of course, exactly what we've seen. The peso has dropped significantly. It had already been in trouble earlier on this year, but we've seen another hit to the value of the peso. But the fact that Mexico is able to not just say that we're the likely target in times of currency volatility, but actually to seek out the financing and secure it from an organization like the IMF is a sign of how mature Mexican macroeconomic policy has become. Mexico also sees this as being a challenge that it doesn't want to face on its own, that it would be much better if the three countries of North America come together to provide a unified response. And once again, to emphasize the importance of regional cooperation. In a time when, it's becoming a dirty word in Europe, the alternative model, the NAFTA model, which is much less ambitious in terms of building institutions, not really any kind of political collaboration there, or the creation of supranational institutions, that has a resonance in these times that is important to emphasize. I think that what we're seeing is that Mexico is concerned that there will obviously be fallout for the conversations over TPP and TTIP. stories that Mexico already is working on putting together an agreement for governing its trade relations with Britain outside of the European Union. But they know that this will slow down the other processes and takes away some of the minimal political support that exists right there. And I think that brings me back to part of your original question, which is that trade is not a popular thing these days. And Laura, yeah, you're right, it's always been tricky. And when I used to teach on international political economy and talking about the political economy of trade, I used to say, I think one of the reasons why trade is so complicated in political terms is because people think they understand it. People apply a very simplistic interpretation of trade because, you know, when they were in the playground at school as a kid, they would trade, you know, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for a hot dog or something like that, you know? It's a simple concept, you know, and then we grow up and we learn about Adam Smith, and it's a natural propensity to truck and barter. So, of course, it's simple, it's natural. What they never actually understand, I think, and partly is because we do a lousy job of explaining it, is that trade is about much more than just moving goods back and forth, about going to your supermarket, etc. And I mean, a great piece that came out recently in the Financial Times by Gillian Tett, talking about why Mexico has a tough time explaining its importance in the United States, is that when you try to talk about an integrated production platform in North America, people's eyes roll and then they start to yawn. And of course they do, because who knows what an integrated production platform actually means? You know, people want to say, well, but we trade with each other, right? Isn't that the important thing? And don't the Mexicans sell more to us than we sell to them? And then it becomes very, very difficult to get people back on track. And I think you're seeing that in the conversation about globalization in general. And then you come to the sort of the trickier issues about migration. And a lot of people in North America today still believe that NAFTA and immigration are linked together. And partly they're right, because in the original debates over the NAFTA back in the 1990s, of course, there was this idea by the proponents of NAFTA that it would solve immigration from Mexico, whereas in fact, immigration intensified rapidly and dramatically in the years after the signing of the NAFTA. You know, it was by the year 2000, we were seeing 500,000 Mexicans a year moving to the United States. And so people could legitimately say, well, we're trading more than ever with each other, and there's more and more Mexicans coming across the border. The fact that that has dropped off and now we're in net negative, or at least net zero migration from Mexico, is not important anymore, because that has left its mark, I think, in political terms. So I think we need to go back and we need to think very, very carefully about how we talk about NAFTA and how we actually come up with a convincing and persuasive message about NAFTA. Because the other guys, as we've discussed many times, the other guys have a great story about NAFTA. It's evil because American jobs are lost because of NAFTA. Make it as simple as possible, and people are much more likely to buy it.
Good, thank you. It's what a difference a week makes. Last week, I was lamenting that the NAFTA wasn't enough like the European Union, because the European Union had this multifaceted enforcement mechanism and was really much more efficient in getting things done. And interest in North America had dwindled, and we were moving at very slow incremental steps. And now this week, NAFTA is, for better or worse, an island of stability. And the incremental limited approach that only deals with a relatively small range of trade and economic issues, that turns out to be the way to go. That being too ambitious and trying to bring too many issues into the tent may be a recipe for disaster. So that's one observation. And now that we're in this week, is the Brexit a sign of dominoes toppling, and it's all going to fall apart, and our trade agreements are going to dissolve, and we're going to become, back to the Great Depression, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and protectionist walls going up everywhere? Or do we use the lesson of Brexit to recommit to stable trade integration and stable engagement, certainly maybe with our Pacific partners? This may give new impetus to approval of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But I agree with what Duncan was saying about the branding of NAFTA. And it's not just a branding problem, although I agree it is a branding problem. We look at some of the public opinion studies that have been coming out, polls this week, and you know, do you object to the NAFTA? And you know, 25% say yes, and 50% say they don't know. If you ask that question in a different way, and you say, are you in favor of selling more goods from your community to foreign markets? Say, yeah. Are you in favor of attracting more investment to your community? Yeah. Are you in favor of making it easier for small and medium-sized businesses to sell their products abroad? You say, yeah. But if you call it trade, you call it NAFTA, it becomes a negative thing. But I also think that we have done a poor job of extending the benefits of NAFTA to small and medium-sized enterprises, to the full social inclusion agenda of that trade agreement. Because NAFTA became a bad brand, we stopped working at it after it you know, did the bare minimum. But we haven't looked at ways that we can make it easier for small and medium-sized enterprises to play a role. We really haven't been effective in our adjustment assistance, in our investment in new skills and new skilling, so that workers who are displaced by the NAFTA are have a way to move forward. So I think that if we are going to rebrand trade, and if we are going to successfully move ahead with it, we need a commitment from our leaders to this social and economic inclusion agenda. The SMEs have been too busy doing business, you know, making a living, keeping the lights on in their shops, to worry about accumulation of rules of origin. We rely on our political and governmental leaders to make trade easier, to reduce transaction costs, trade facilitation, which our customs folks are largely responsible for. These are areas that we need to be working on. A lot of this can be done at the official level. We don't need necessarily new laws and new rules, but we do need political leadership in order to push this inclusion agenda.
Tony, you had one final thing you wanted to add to
Just to add, reinforcing, I hope, both what Duncan and Laura said, we do need to be smarter in telling the stories about trade and about NAFTA. I find it's a lot easier for me to understand also when I use the example of a CRV put together in Jalisco and say 70% of the value of that CRV is from either the United States or Canada. That shows that it gives a concrete example that this integrated network is actually integrated and working. And Andrew Seeley of the Wilson Center recently published an article where he went and talked about examples of Mexican investment in the United States and the jobs that had created. And I think we do need to just tell real stories like that to bring it home to people that this is not trading the peanut butter for the hot dog, but it is providing, it's making it that we can make these goods more competitively if we're doing it together. And it gives concrete examples, so we need to do that. And then, as Laura was saying, there is responsibility certainly, and we need that political leadership, people who are willing to go out and say why this is important, and then give goals and objectives and set deadlines to go do this work. Secondly, we've got millions of stakeholders who are benefiting from this relationship right now, and most of them are just being quiet when there's criticism in public. And somehow there needs to be a way to involve and mobilize these stakeholders so they're willing to say, yeah, you know, the 100 jobs at my factory depend on this network. And they will say that locally. You know, we wouldn't have these if we weren't trading with these two countries. We need to find a way to involve and mobilize all these people in the three countries, but particularly in the United States.
Right, good. Why don't we open it up? I'll start with a round of 3 questions. So we have microphones that we're going to pass around, people for asking the questions. Please state your name when you do. We're going to start here in the front of the room. Any other hands up at this point? I'll identify anybody. All right, you'll think about it as this question's being asked.
I'll ask 3 questions. Actually, I do have a question for each of you. Dave Nelson with GE. So you highlighted international and regional cooperation as one of the topic areas that is likely to be discussed at the NALS. And I think, Laura, you mentioned that that would be likely one of the key areas where they're most likely to get results. And Duncan, you said that Peña Nieto is now focusing on foreign policy, that he's paying more attention to that. So first question for Duncan, what are Peña Nieto's foreign policy priorities? What are his 3 top international priorities? Surely it's not visas from Canada, although that might be somewhere, but what are the 3 top things he'd like to achieve? And Laura, the same question for you. What are Canada's top, what are Trudeau's top 3 priorities? And Tony, a different question for you. These mechanisms that have been created, the trilateral energy conversation, there are bilateral things like the HLED that you're familiar with Mexico, the regulatory harmonization with Canada. As you know, when administrations in the U.S. change, frequently people want to throw out everything and start over fresh, even if they're in the same party. What are the prospects for continuity of the North American mechanisms?
So let me start with answering that, because Duncan's going to have to leave us in about 10, 15 minutes. And so Duncan, why don't you go ahead and jump in and answer that part of the question, and any other part you wish.
Okay. So let me talk about the Peña Nieto's priorities. I think that he's shown that climate change is a priority for this government in terms of its foreign policy. And partly that's a reflection not just of what he believes, but much more importantly about what Relaciones Exteriores, the Cancillería, believes. Since the COP16 in Cancun, what's extraordinary is how there has been such deep buy-in from the Foreign Affairs Ministry in Mexico into this issue. They've actually, I was having a conversation with a diplomat the other day up in Ottawa, a Mexican diplomat, and talking about how, Mexico kind of fell into this because Calderón was so enthusiastic about it, and they were forced to develop some kind of expertise. And then in the Cancun COP meeting, Mexico saved the day by actually forcing everybody to sit down and come to an agreement, finally, after the disaster of Copenhagen. And they came very close to blowing it, but they were able to pull everybody back together. And of course, Patricia Espinosa, who was the foreign minister at the time, has now been put in charge of a UN initiative on climate change. And this has led to the bureaucracy and the diplomatic corps in particular buying into the issue of climate change. So they feel as though they're not just committed to the issue, but they're equipped and they have the resources to actually play a leading role. I think the second issue for Peña Nieto is, of course, North America. I think that that's one of the things that his administration has shown time and time again that they're deeply committed to. And you might say, well, is it North America or is it the United States? But I think that they know that the way to really approach this that sells well at home as well as internationally is to talk about the region. And so that's what we're seeing with his commitment to this. And, the frustrations of having to deal with the Stephen Harper government for a number of years and not being able to make real progress, I think were apparent. But the number one priority for Mexican foreign policy is its image in the United States. And that is something which, sadly, was a priority back in 2012 when they came into power. It was clear in those days that Americans had a negative image of Mexico. That famous word map that was published by a consulting firm Villanovo, which showed what are the words that Americans associate with Mexico. And the largest words on that word map were violence, drugs, crime, security, etc. It was all negative. I mean, there were a couple of positive words down there, but they were down in the corners and in very small type. And sadly, that hasn't changed. And in fact, of course, because of what's going on in the US presidential campaigns, we can even say that it's gotten worse. And so we're seeing the charm offensive right now from Mexico. We're seeing a concerted effort to try to work out how to improve Mexico's brand here. But I still think that there's a long way to go on that. I think they really do need to focus not just on putting out interesting bits of information, statistics, etc. I mean, that's important, but they've got to start to focus on stories, as Tony was saying. I mean, we've talked about this a number of times over the past few weeks. We need a high-ranking, 5-star U.S. general to come out and say, Mexican Americans are crucial to the effectiveness of the United States Armed Forces, and then to tell stories about how Mexican Americans have actually been heroes defending the American homeland. Those are the stories. It's not going to happen overnight, but you need to have that kind of story which hits people not here, but here or in the gut. That's what the anti-Mexico camp does extremely well. That's what the anti-NAFTA camp does really well. It's about the gut. It's not about the brain at this point in time. And we need to work much harder on that.
Laura, on Trudeau's
Sure.
policy priorities?
You know what? He didn't call me. He do. I did hear from his office, but he didn't call me directly, so I'm extrapolating a little bit on this. As you know, as a former diplomat, David, I don't know how much you dealt with Canada, but when Canada goes to a meeting with the United States, they bring the list, the irritants list. They unfurl it, and it's softwood lumber, calendarized paper, 17 different things. And the U.S. comes and says, well, we're kind of interested in intellectual property, and how's it going? So Canada is known as a sort of irritants-based partner for the United States. I think that they are trying to reset that relationship. Another problem with the previous government, and again, this is another lesson from diplomacy. Don't ask a question in public where you know the answer is going to be no. It's just going to, it's going to work badly for both of you. So I don't think Canada is going to go after the irritants in this meeting. It's not going to go after the softwood lumber. It's not going to go after pipeline permitting. It is, I think, going to really firmly establish itself as a strong partner for the United States and Mexico, a good source of energy and initiatives and new proposals. Canadians are very good at coming up with stuff, taking notes, and calling the next meeting. I think that reliability in the relationship is something that Canada will want to focus on. I also think that they want to show that they are more than just, that the Trudeau government is more than just sunny ways. I said yesterday that he was more than just a pretty face, and I got slammed on Twitter because I said, don't hate him because he's beautiful. But
It's a terrible thing, I have to say.
It's a burden we all
It really
have.
is.
the curse of beauty. But I think But I think he'll want to come up with proof of concept, that not just sunny ways, but Canada is also an effective partner. And so I think that the top three things that Canada wants are those sort of repositioning, being taken seriously, and offering something of substance, setting the stage so that those irritants can be taken up in whatever a fora is most effective, whether it's behind closed doors or it's a dispute settlement process, whatever that is. I think they're trying to make sure that when Canada comes knocking with its irritants list, it will get a warmer welcome than perhaps it has in the past. Energy and climate change are going to be a leader for Canada in this NALS. They are also, I suspect, going to continue to push the expansion of the temporary movement list in the from the NAFTA, the temporary movement of people. They know the answer is going to be no from the United States. They know that the U.S. is not prepared to talk about it, but I think they're going to continue to gently but persistently suggest that that list ought to be renovated because it really hasn't been expanded since 1994. And there are more high-tech jobs in the world now than computer systems analysts. So I think they're going to push that, but they're going to push it gently. They're not going to set the world on fire.
And Tony, about the prospects of continuity of this process into a new U.S. administration?
Well, one of the challenges of all relationships when we have a transition of administrations is getting it to continue building on the things that work and fixing the things that don't work. We've seen this in North America with the structures that were put together in the early 2000s being dismantled when President Obama and his administration came in. We're now back to the position of creating this version of a number of these institutions. So one of the key things from this summit, I hope, will be that some of these things will be more institutionalized. Some of the things that can make that happen, in fact, are that stakeholders who are getting benefit from this speak up and that they talk to a new administration, whatever administration that will be. There'll clearly be one outcome where it will be harder than another outcome to maintain this. But it isn't unique to North America. But it is something that regularly happens with North America because people don't think about the importance of it. There was a Council of Foreign Relations study in 2014 that again looked at this, and one of the things they really recommended was institutionalizing a focus on North America because the U.S. bureaucracy is not set up to have that focus. And it does help in a government to have a bureaucracy that reinforces the importance of a particular set of issues. And I still think that is needed in the U.S. bureaucracy. So I hope we'll see more of that coming out of this meeting in Ottawa than we saw coming out of Toluca a couple of years ago.
And if I can just jump in here, Jim, I mean, one of the things that we've been talking about a lot here at the Wilson Center is the need to have a meaningful stakeholder outreach mechanism. The fact is that you can build it into the foreign ministries of all three countries. You can have these regular meetings, but if it's entirely divorced from what's going on in the real world, from the concerns of not just business, but of civil society as well, then you're only going to achieve partial successes. So one of the things that we're really hoping to see is, in fact, the creation of a stakeholder mechanism out of this NNELS that will incorporate the civil society and business sectors of all three countries in an agile way that enables you to actually come up with meaningful recommendations for first of all, the foreign ministries, and then for the leaders themselves to embrace.
And where do you think the focal point of the stakeholder mechanism should be, Duncan?
I would imagine it should probably be somewhere in the Washington area, I would guess.
Maybe find an institution that has some Canada and Mexico focus, and that would be good.
Your words,
My
not
word.
mine, Jim.
I'm a visitor here, so I get to do that. I get to say that. And what will be key, obviously, to the transition are the efforts of the Canadian and Mexican governments that are not, in this particular cycle, going through and have to help continue with the focus on this and the importance of it and so on. Another question here. Let's wait for the microphone quickly. And then David, and then in the back there. So first, the young lady in the front here. Put up your hand. Yeah, of course. When you're at my stage, everyone jump.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Good morning. My name is Marta Galicia. I just finished a master program in conflict analysis and resolution, and now tomorrow I am flying back to live in Mexico again. Yeah, so I'm curious, from my perspective of conflict resolver, or at least analyst, and sorry for derailing the conversation from trade and these very interesting things, but about human rights and the rule of law. I wonder what's the position of Canada and North America. How can you build trust on a government who has repeatedly committed human rights violations, and that the rule of law is very weak, and we have a lot of problems with violence and crime? Precisely because I think that after these strategies of Rápido y Furioso, and like the American government just tried to regain a strategy, but I don't see it clearly what it is going on. I used to say that it's like you see that your neighbor garden is in fire and you do nothing, and then the fire spreads and you just watch. And I don't see a clear or different approach to this policy. So, and what's the role of Canada too? That would be very interesting to know.
Thank you, Marta. Let's take the question from David. Back here. And then the last one will be the gentleman that has his hand up in the back.
Hi, I'm David, David Biet, and my question relates to this one a little bit too. Duncan brought up civil society, and it's interesting that the whole North American question has, by and large, been based around trade, trade, economic development. We branched out into an energy, environment. But when you get into these questions of trust in civil society, and just looking at the news of the teacher strike in Mexico, for example, like, wow, this is part of North America, where we're this. And then you've got other folks in Canada, the United States, who kind of reflecting what's happened in Britain, they kind of feel left out and are wary of experts. Where do those folks fit in, and how does it tie in with what the previous question has about justice in Mexico?
Excellent. And then our third question, the gentleman back, hold up your hand.
Rafael Bernal with The Hill. You've been talking about how the transitional period in the United States is affecting these talks, sort of, I guess you could say, making them softer. The opposition in Mexico is trying to provoke an early transitional period. You have López Obrador talking already about a transitional government. Not exactly sure what he means by that, but do you think Peña Nieto's, the foreign policy goals you laid out, do you think they're being weakened by this opposition and by the way they're acting?
All right, well, we better start with Duncan. A lot of the questions have to do with Mexico, and he has to leave in 2 minutes, so
All
go,
right.
Duncan, go.
Just very, very quickly, I mean, to begin with on North America, the issues that are being discussed there, that you've raised rather, are discussed between the leaders. There are conversations about questions of rule of law, collaboration on public security, and issues beyond the trade and competitiveness agenda. But there is limited buy-in from Canada. Canada has a number of bilateral initiatives with Mexico on questions of rule of law, has helped out, for example, with police training, as well as the retraining of judges for the justice reform process, etc. But it's nowhere near as important a player as the United States is, of course. And the United States, through the Merida Initiative, is deeply engaged with Mexico on a wide array of issues to do with justice, citizen security, etc. There's also, of course, the restriction that you see, which is that, well, these are internal issues. I mean, these are to do with what's happening within Mexico, and Mexico has traditionally been quite, well, has jealously guarded issues of sovereignty on this. And, of course, in particular, this government in Mexico, which has a more traditional approach to these issues, much more so than its predecessor, the Felipe Calderón government. But even under Calderón, there were limits to what you could actually do and which issues you could engage with them. But your point, which is that if you have a problem, and this speaks directly to David's question as well, if you have that problem in one of the NAFTA countries, you know, do you have to worry about it spreading across, you know, the fires crossing the world? Well, first of all, the violence problem doesn't spread, but the drugs problem is certainly there, and overall questions of law-abiding citizens, of the fact that you have a gap in the rule of law within the region. That's a very big challenge, and it impacts directly upon the competitiveness agenda. As I said in my earlier comments, Mexico's failure to actually impose the rule of law, to reduce violence levels, does drag its economic performance down. Nobody really knows by how much, because I think every analyst is kind of shooting in the dark, and the statistics they pull up are very difficult to believe a lot of the time. But it is a drag on Mexican competitiveness, and thereby, by extension, it's a drag on North American competitiveness. So I think that it's certainly an issue of concern. But being propositive rather than overly critical, certainly in public, has been the way to go in the past, and I think we'll see a continuation of that, which is that tell us how we can help. What are the programs that you're trying to enact that perhaps we have some expertise in, or we could dedicate some resources to? Because that seems to be a much more effective way of engaging with the Mexican government. And at the beginning of this administration, the Peña Nieto administration, even that didn't work particularly well. But within the first year, the Mexican government come around to the idea that, in fact, they do need international assistance. And, in fact, they can benefit, in particular, from bilateral collaboration with the United States. And then, you know, the question that you ask about Mexico's opposition, you know, I think we're all sitting here right now and we're saying, well, and I had conversations in Mexico City last week with people everyone gave me a different story about what the 2018 election actually offers us. A lot of people believe that Andrés Manuel López Obrador is a viable candidate. And not just a viable candidate, but actually will challenge the other two major parties, because the PRD now doesn't seem to be a major challenger for 2018. So it will be sort of pre-PAN and Morena challenging for the presidency. I still see it as being kind of difficult for Andrés Manuel to get the numbers that he needs to win the presidency. Not impossible by any stretch of the imagination, not impossible. But when you begin to see how the PRI itself stacks up, around 28% of the popular vote, Combine that with the Verdes, who have gone down from 10% down to 4%, but that gets you up to 32%. And then you have a couple of other smaller parties, PANAL and maybe one other with 1% each. All of a sudden, you're at 34%. The next presidential election in Mexico will be one with around 30%. And if you can get 34, then you're looking pretty good. So there's all kinds of things that can happen before then. The challenge that he raises, however, is to say, well, is Mexico as politically stable as we thought it was? Are all the changes that have happened, on very positive changes on the economic policy front under Peña Nieto, are they guaranteed? Nothing's guaranteed, but it would actually be very difficult to roll those back. In the same way as we talk about a US candidate coming in and rolling back the NAFTA, that's a very big thing to do. It takes time, and you'd have to generate coalitions and all those other things. But what you can do is you can throw sand into the gears of commerce. You can throw sand into the gears of foreign investment. And that's something which I think a lot of people are worried about at this point in time.
Laura, you're part in terms of how Canada's
Sure.
affected by this?
Back when we were doing the Free Trade Area of the Americas, which I'm sure you're too young to remember, there was a strong message that was sent that the Free Trade Area of the Americas was a democracies only club, that if you were going to become a member of this, you had to do a number of reforms. So it was conditionality on membership in the FTAA. And I think that the notion that trade agreements can be used as leverage for other sorts of reforms is pervasive in our thinking, but its effectiveness is not completely clear. There is very little follow-up of the sort of capacity building that would allow for the rule of law, anti-corruption elements to actually be played out by certain countries. And also, I think an important part of this is not just capacity building, but supervision or surveillance or transparency or whatever you want to call it, that somebody else is watching and making sure that you're doing what it is that you said you were going to do. Now, in the case of Canada, it has historically gone back and forth between this sort of soft power. We can be helpful in all sorts of places. We can bring our kinder, gentler, persuasive selves to tables. You know, we are not the United States. We're not going to shove it down your throat. We're going to help give you incremental, positive approaches, you know, doing what can be done under the circumstances. And that's terrific, but Canada's sort of major soft power period resulted in criticisms that we were everywhere but accomplishing very little. And so during the Harper era, they changed that to a more targeted pursuit of national interest. So we're only going to pick 4 or 5 things that we're really interested in, but by gosh, we're just going to hit them hard. And it remains to be seen what the Trudeau government is going to do, whether they're going to try to find a balance between soft power participation, but also, targeted, focused effectiveness. It's tough. But if they do re-engage, with Mexico, in my opinion, they really do need to go beyond trade, but to look at issues of capacity and supervision so that Mexico does what it says it does and is able to do what it says it's going to do. And Canada has given that signal in its re-engagement, or at least talking to Russia again, rather than, oh, we don't talk to bad guys. Now the signal from the foreign ministry is, no, if you want to change the world, you have to engage with the world. So we may see that in Mexico as well.
Master, you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, only to say that there are always a category of issues that are domestic issues in partner countries, including the United States, that they don't want to publicly debate with even their closest friends. And I won't go through and list the ones in the United States, but I bet you could all think about them, some things that the government would not want to have a public debate with anybody about. That's also true with Mexico. But what is true with Mexico is that there are private conversations about all of these issues. It's also true that the United States has offered about $2 billion worth of assistance under the MERIDA program to train people, to provide capacity building, to share best practices, which I think has helped have an impact. And if you step back and look at the institutions where they were in 2007, 2008 in Mexico and where they are today, there's been improvement in a number of those institutions and in a number of parts of the country. But there are clearly other places where there's a lot more improvement needed. The U.S. strategy has been to offer assistance, to have private discussions, and allow our civil society and others to speak out as frankly as they want on these issues, and that's happening internationally. And one of the very hopeful things is that civil society in Mexico is speaking up more regularly and demanding changes, both in the case of injustice and violence, and also against corruption. And that's where the change really needs to come from. It needs to be domestically motivated and based. And I think we are seeing changes there. There are some problems that cross the borders. And I think if we look, a couple things I would say, if we look at border management related to violence, related to crime, related to immigration, there's been significant improvement in how that's been handled over the past 4 and 5 years. There are still really big problems, drug trafficking, money laundering related to that, and the opiates addictions throughout the United States is part of that problem. It's a part that demands that the 3 governments or the 2 governments work together, because it brings pain, violence, and corruption from those poor communities in Guerrero that grow opium to the communities in New Hampshire or wherever, where we have a lot of people now becoming addicted to these opiates, either man-made or grown and enhanced by man-made chemicals. So those are issues where cooperation is a natural thing and would be welcomed. And otherwise, there are these really difficult issues that we will continue to work on, both publicly and privately, with our neighbor.
Just for a couple more questions, if they're out there. Okay. Oh, we do have one more right up here. Good. Yes, please,
So
go
they
ahead.
can-
It's right there.
so they
Yeah,
can-
record it.
Hear it on the,
So you can be
camera.
live and international. It's going everywhere.
Just be mean.
My 5 minutes of fame.
Betcha.
Good morning. My name is Olga Cano. I'm with the EPA and I work with the CC. And my question comes to regarding the environment. So I think all of you have mentioned climate change as one of the priorities for the 3 countries. How do you see the CEC playing a role in this, and how could they contribute to move these points forward?
For the crowd, explain the CEC.
So the CEC is the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, and essentially it's the side environmental agreement to the NAFTA.
I can start.
Yep.
So, again, old people in the room, you remember that the North American Free Trade Agreement could not be ratified without specific provisions on labor and the environment. And so we got these side agreements on labor and the environment, and it was the first agreement in the world that had these side agreements, and it laid an important foundation for the inclusion of environmental measures and other trade agreements. So good for NAFTA, good for us. The challenge with the environmental side agreements was that there was not a common core of environmental standards or rules that everyone had to follow. The basic model was everyone must have environmental rules and must follow them. And if you don't follow your own rules, then you'll be slapped on the wrist. There really wasn't an effective dispute settlement mechanism either. But what there is the CIC and the CEC. And the CEC is an effective forum for trilateral discussion of issues, of identifying those issues that are priorities, and in making recommendations to our leaders about what ought to happen next, and also in providing information and outreach to stakeholders, bringing together stakeholder meetings. So that's great. What I'd like to see for the CEC, though, is now that we have so much experience with this, I'd like to see you guys get some more teeth. I'd like to see you have a more effective, be attached to a more effective dispute settlement mechanism. I would like to see some more development of common rules of the road. And I'd like to just see more of you. You are an institution that works. I'd like to see you work more better.
I agree.
Good. Let's wrap it up now. Please join me in a round of applause for the panelists. And I know our thoughts will be with the 3 leaders as they meet tomorrow. Again, I think we've seen, as we started out this session, talking about how the world is somewhat roiled by discussions of trade and national identities and what NAFTA kind of represents as a model that seems to be working, and hopefully the leaders will highlight that and then continue to move forward in improving the NAFTA model and expanding it. Again, thank you very much for all being here, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Excellent.